Her cabin windows rattled under the force of the howling wind, and the swirling snow threatened to bury everything in its path. On that very night, a wild Mustang appeared at her doorstep, battered and trembling, but the real miracle was just beginning. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. She fought to breathe in the freezing air, leaning against the rough wooden wall inside her small cabin, trying to grasp what she'd just seen through the icy window. The storm outside was no ordinary blizzard. It howled with a fury that stole visibility beyond a few feet, and the winds pummeled the cabin with the force of a furious giant. Snow piled up against the door, forming an icy barricade that threatened to seal her in. That morning, she had woken to a clear sky and moderate winter chill. But now, just a handful of hours later, nature had unleashed a wrathful onslaught that she never could have predicted. Her name was Eleanor Carter, a 52-year-old widow whose nearest human neighbor was miles away. She'd chosen this lonely patch of Wyoming wilderness for its solace, for the quiet that let her grieve her late husband in a world removed from prying eyes and everyday trivialities. She had survived tough winters alone since his passing, but this storm carried with it a sense of dread she had never felt before. Beneath the shriek of the wind, there were ominous groans of bending trees and snapping branches, noises that sent jolts of fear through her exhausted body. Outside, the darkness was near total, save for occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated a swirl of white so thick it looked like some monstrous vortex intent on swallowing the entire landscape. It was in one of those flickers that she saw movement, an impossible sight, the outline of a horse stumbling through the drifts. At first, her mind refused to believe it. No sensible creature would be out in this fury. But then she heard a faint whinny carried by the wind, and her heart clenched. Something was out there, and it was alive. She pulled on her late husband's oversized coat, the one with the sheepskin lining, and wrapped a scarf around her face, leaving only her eyes uncovered. The moment she cracked the door open, the wind tore it from her grip, flinging it backward and nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow blasted into the cabin in a swirling cloud. She pushed her weight against the door to keep it from slamming. Shut again. Squinting through the darkness, she made out a shape stumbling toward her, large, four-legged, its mane and tail whipped by the storm. As it neared, she realized it was a Mustang, a wild horse, soaked through and shivering. Its coat was matted with ice, and blood streaked its flank. She gasped, heart thudding with both pity and fear. Horses weren't strangers to this region, but rarely did they approach human dwellings unless they were in dire straits. This one looked beyond desperate, barely standing, eyes rolling white with terror and exhaustion. Summoning strength she didn't know she had, Eleanor stepped out, plunging up to her thighs in snow. The icy wind sliced through her coat, making her gasp as she fought her way toward the horse. Instinct told her to be cautious. A wild Mustang in panic could thrash or kick, but when she extended a trembling hand, the horse didn't bolt. It merely stood there, sides heaving, staring at her as if it understood it had reached its last hope. She grabbed a handful of its tangled mane and tried to coax it forward. The horse stumbled, nearly dropping to its knees. Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't bring it inside the cabin. It wouldn't fit. The barn was her only option, though it had been mostly unused since her husband's passing. She had stored hay there for the odd times horses wandered into her property, but it was old and she didn't know if it was enough. She tugged gently on the Mustang's mane, urging it toward the barn doors. The snowdrifts were waist high, and she slipped more than once, fear creeping in that she too might collapse. Each step felt like a struggle against the entire weight of the storm pressing down on her. Her breath burned in her lungs, and she couldn't feel her toes. Yet somehow, bit by bit, they made it. She yanked on the barn door, which was half buried in snow. It creaked in protest. The Mustang's ears flicked back, and it let out a distressed snort. She whispered soothing words she hoped would calm it, though the wind likely snatched her voice away before it reached the horse's ears. At last, the door gave, and they stumbled into the barn. Stale air and darkness enveloped them, but at least they were out of the wind. She maneuvered the horse toward an old stall. The horse nearly collapsed once inside, and she barely managed to get the door shut behind them. Her heart pounded. She could hardly believe that in the midst of this brutal storm, fate, or perhaps something else, had guided this wounded Mustang to her door. As she closed the stall, the horse let out a ragged exhale, nostrils flaring by the faint glow of her flashlight. She could see blood frozen in patches on its flank. Her breath caught in her throat. The poor creature had likely tangled with barbed wire, or maybe even a predator. Wolves roamed these parts, especially in harsh winters. But she didn't see claw marks. It looked more like a deep gash from jagged metal. Gently, she ran a hand near the wound to assess the damage. The horse flinched but didn't lash out. She recognized that it must be close to total exhaustion, teetering between life and death. Her instincts screamed at her to get some kind of medical supplies, though her stock was meager. Leftover bandages, antiseptics that had passed their expiration date, and some herbal mixtures she'd learned to make for basic livestock care. She hurried back to the cabin through the shrieking storm, praying the horse would not collapse in her absence. Inside, the temperature was dropping rapidly. Without steady electricity, she relied on a small gas generator and a wood stove, but fuel was running low. The generator had sputtered out the day before, and she'd been saving wood to last the storm, never expecting it would rage so fiercely. Her eyes flicked to the small stack of logs left by the stove. Suddenly, caring for the horse felt like an impossible choice. Could she sacrifice precious warmth she needed for herself? But something in her heart refused to abandon the creature. It had come here, to her door. She couldn't let it die. She packed what little medical supplies she had into a small plastic case and grabbed an old blanket. With a determined set to her jaw, she plunged back into the blizzard, fighting every step to get to the barn. The door banged behind her, and she slid the ancient wooden bolt in place. The interior of the barn was dark, lit only by the thin beam of her flashlight. The horse stood where she left it, head low, flanks trembling. Its eyes widened at her approach, but it made no move to run or attack. She wondered if it even had the strength. She spread the old blanket across its back, feeling the icy dampness of its coat beneath her fingertips. Then she pried open her plastic case and took out an antiseptic solution. Her hands shook as she applied it to the wound, dabbing away bits of crusted blood and ice, wincing as the horse flinched. She whispered apologies, hoping her soft tone would keep it calm. Every second, she was aware of the storm outside, like a living beast trying to claw its way in. The barn walls creaked, battered by the gale. She could practically feel the temperature dropping with each passing moment. Survival for both of them was precarious at best. As the night wore on, she stayed with the horse, feeding it bits of old hay she found in the corner. She worried it might be moldy or insufficient in nutrients, but it was all she had. The Mustang chewed slowly, occasionally raising its head to look at her. She saw something in its gaze, a silent plea, or maybe gratitude. It stirred a memory of when she and her husband had rescued a stray dog years ago, before they'd moved to this remote homestead. That dog had grown into a loyal companion. But this was a wild Mustang, not a pet, and she had no illusions about forging a simple bond with such a creature. Yet here it was, relying on her entirely. When the storm showed no sign of relenting, she decided to risk bringing more wood from the cabin and building a small fire in the old metal drum that her husband had once used as a makeshift heater for the barn. It was dangerous. Fire hazards were everywhere, from the dry wooden beams to scattered straw. But if she didn't try, the horse's shivering might escalate into shock. She rummaged through the barn until she found a rusted vent pipe. With numb fingers, she set about creating a safe path for the smoke. The entire process was nerve-wracking, but eventually she managed to start a small, carefully contained fire. Warmth flickered against the horse's coat, and steam rose where the heat touched the ice on its fur. She felt her own limbs slowly thawing, though the howling wind outside served as a constant reminder that they were not truly safe. Hours slipped by in a haze of exhaustion. She dozed on and off, jerking awake at every groan of the barn or shift of the horse's hooves. At one point, she dreamt of her husband standing in a sunlit field, waving at her to come join him, the golden grass swaying in a warm breeze. She woke with tears in her eyes, the barn's darkness and cold reality rushing back. The Mustang was still breathing, though unevenly. It was a small victory. She rose to check its wounds again, replaced the blanket with one less soaked through, and fed it a bit more hay. She thought about the phrase she'd so often heard around these parts. Only the toughest survive out here. She never fully grasped what it meant until she faced this night. By dawn, the storm's ferocity hadn't lessened. If anything, the wind screeched louder and drifts piled high around every structure. She ventured a peek outside, pressing her eye to a gap in the barn door. Nothing but white greeted her. Panic blossomed in her chest. She wasn't sure how much longer her supplies would last. She had to ration her wood carefully and figure out a way to melt snow for water, both for herself and the horse. On top of that, she had limited food, some canned goods, a bit of dried jerky, and a few ration bars. That might sustain her for a while, but the horse needed far more sustenance than she could provide in this environment. She felt an icy coil of fear wrap around her heart. Even if they survived the storm, what then? Could she get out to the main road for help? Her land was isolated, and even when the weather was good, traveling to the nearest town took hours. Now, it felt impossible. Yet, as she watched the Mustang flick its ears, raising its head to catch the faint warmth from the dying fire, she refused to give in to despair. They had made it through the night. That was something. She crouched by the fire drum, feeding it another small piece of wood and hoping it would hold out a bit longer. Smoke curled up through the makeshift vent. Her face stung from the cold, and she realized she needed to check on the generator in the cabin. Maybe, by some miracle, it still had enough life to give them a little bit of light or run the small space heater. She stood and whispered to the horse, "I'll be back." The Mustang flicked an ear but otherwise stayed still. She paused a moment, amazed that a wild creature would allow her near. The horse must have been beyond exhaustion to accept her presence. Yet she felt a tug of connection, as if they were two survivors bound by the same determination. Outside, the wind slammed into her again the moment she inched the barn door open. The world was a twisted, monochrome landscape of white and grey, snow piled in eerie, contorted shapes. She forced her way forward, one step at a time, leaning into the wind to keep from being swept off her feet. Each step was a battle as the blizzard tried to shove her backward. She slipped, cursed under her breath, and scrambled to maintain her footing. Her eyes watered from the biting cold, and her lungs burned with each gasp. It felt like a small eternity before she reached the cabin door. She kicked away the snow blocking the threshold and shouldered her way in. The interior was colder than before, the stove nearly out. Only a few glowing embers remained. With trembling hands, she placed a log inside and fanned it gently. Eventually, a small flame licked up the side, offering a feeble glow. She hurried to the corner where the generator rested, turning it over to see if there was any fuel left. The gauge was low, dangerously low. She tried the ignition and it sputtered, coughed, then roared to life for a few brief seconds before dying again. The dull ache of frustration settled in her chest. There wouldn't be enough to power anything substantial. She resigned herself to the reality that she was on her own without modern conveniences. She grabbed more blankets, an old first aid kit that might have a few bandages left, and a small bundle of emergency candles. Her provisions were meager, but she had no choice. Stepping back outside, she glanced at the horizon, or at least where it should have been. The sky was a solid sheet of swirling clouds, dumping more snow by the minute. A gust nearly knocked her over. She had to brace herself against the cabin wall, heart hammering in her chest. Every trip outside drained her strength. She trudged back to the barn, clinging to the faint hope that the Mustang was still standing, that together they might find a way to endure. Even as her body screamed for rest, she pressed on, driven by a combination of pity, duty, and a flicker of companionship she felt for this creature that had appeared at her door at the worst possible time. When she finally reached the barn and secured the door behind her, she found the Mustang lying down, breathing heavily. She hurried to its side, worried that it might have taken a turn for the worse. Its eyes were half closed, and for a frightening second, she thought it wasn't breathing. Then she saw its flank expand with a labored inhalation. Relief flooded her. She knelt beside it, checking the wound again and adjusting the blanket. The horse's ear flicked at her touch. She sat there, breathing in the musty barn air, letting her own heartbeat settle. "We'll make it," she whispered, not sure if she was comforting the horse or herself. We have to. Time became meaningless in the storm's grip, a cycle of tending to the horse, feeding the fire, and fighting the cold. She lost track of how many hours passed before she realized she hadn't eaten. Her stomach cramped with hunger, reminding her she wasn't indestructible. She found a corner of the barn relatively shielded from drafts and unwrapped one of her ration bars, biting into the hard, flavorless rectangle. She felt the horse's gaze on her, as if it too were hungry. She offered it another handful of hay, then rummaged through an old wooden chest where she and her husband had stored emergency supplies. Inside, she found a cracked water canteen, some rope, and a dusty tarp. The discoveries were meager, but she counted them as small victories. Every item might be a lifeline. Night came again, or so she guessed, because the darkness outside the barn grew impenetrable. The wind still battered the walls, though perhaps it had died down a fraction. She dared not hope it would calm completely. During a half-conscious doze, she was jolted awake by a deep howl from outside. Wolves! Her blood turned to ice. If there were wolves nearby, they'd be hungry, and they'd smell the horse's blood. Adrenaline spiked, erasing her fatigue. She grabbed an old pitchfork and peered through a gap in the barn siding. At first, all she saw was a blur of white. Then, a shape flickered through the snow, a dark four-legged silhouette with eyes that glowed faintly in the reflection of the flashlight beam. Another shape darted behind it. A sense of dread seized her. She counted at least 3, possibly more. The horse rose onto its feet as if sensing the danger, ears pinned back. It let out a nervous snort, stomping a hoof. Eleanor felt her heart pound. The barn offered some protection, but if the wolves were determined, they could break through, a weak spot, or wait them out until the storm passed, turning this into a siege. She prayed the wolves might move on, but an instinct told her they wouldn't leave so easily, especially if they'd caught the scent of wounded prey. She strained her ears, hearing faint growls and barks over the wind's incessant drone. Fear and anger churned within her. She'd survived heartbreak and the brutal cold, but now she faced a pack of predators that didn't care about her or the horse's struggle for survival. Her grip tightened on the pitchfork. She recalled the rusted rifle in the cabin, but it was nearly impossible to get back there and return safely. Could she fight off a pack alone? She glanced at the Mustang, which was pawing the ground, eyes wide. The horse was weak, but it was still a powerful animal. She'd seen firsthand how a cornered horse could fight. Yet these were wolves, cunning and relentless. She debated whether to risk running to the cabin for the rifle or stay put. The thought of stepping out into that darkness with wolves lurking made her heart race, but without a firearm, she might be powerless if they attacked en masse. After a moment of internal battle, she decided she had to try. Without a word, she unbolted the barn door, bracing herself for the blast of cold. The wind almost knocked her back, and she found herself face to face with a snarling wolf less than 20 feet away. Its eyes glinted with ruthless hunger. She froze in terror. Behind it, more shadows shifted. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something. She raised the pitchfork threateningly, and the wolf flattened its ears, teeth bared. A tense standoff. Summoning courage she didn't realize she possessed, she lunged forward with the pitchfork. The wolf sprang back, startled by the unexpected aggression. She used that moment to slam the barn door shut. Her plan to dash to the cabin was foiled. Now they were trapped inside with no way to retrieve the rifle. Heart hammering, she slid the bolt back into place. The horse snorted, eyes rolling. She hurried to stroke its neck, hoping to calm it. "We're okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if that was a lie. She heard snarls and scraping at the barn's walls. The wolves were circling, searching for a weak point. She grabbed a nearby lantern, turned up the flame, and held it near a crack in the boards. The bright light seemed to keep the wolves at bay, at least temporarily. Still, the standoff had begun. She prayed that the storm's fury might drive them away. but the knowledge that they were there, hungry and waiting, gnawed at her nerves. So began an agonizing stretch of time. She stood guard near the barn door, pitchfork in one hand, lantern in the other, while the horse paced anxiously in the stall. The minutes dragged on. Occasionally, she'd hear a chorus of howls that made her blood run cold. The cold itself was relentless, seeping through the barn walls, making her teeth chatter. She fed the fire in the metal drum whenever she dared, move from the door, but each moment away filled her with dread that the wolves would break through. She couldn't keep this up forever. Weariness tugged at her eyelids, her limbs shaking from exhaustion and cold, but she forced herself to stay awake, to remain vigilant. The horse, too, was on edge, ears flicking at every sound. She thought about her late husband. He would know what to do. He always had a plan, always seemed to keep a steady head in a crisis. But now it was just her, a wounded Mustang, and a pack of wolves in a land where no one was coming to help. She couldn't say exactly when it happened, perhaps sometime past midnight, but the scratching and snarling at the wolves lessened. She realized with a jolt that she could no longer hear the wolves. Did they leave? Or were they lying in wait for her to step outside? She swallowed hard, her body trembling with a mix of cold and adrenaline. She crept to the door and listened. The wind still howled, but beneath it, she heard no growls, no barks. The horse stamped a hoof as if urging caution. Slowly, she slid the bolt open a few inches and peered through the gap. Snow whipped around, but no dark shapes prowled outside, at least none that she could see. She waited, hardly daring to breathe. Nothing. It appeared for the moment they were alone again. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. The wolves might have decided to take shelter somewhere else, or they might be waiting for the storm to break. Regardless, she took the reprieve as a chance to catch her breath. She tended to the Mustang, checking its injuries and offering more. Hey! The wound on its flank looked angry and inflamed, a risk of infection looming large. She used the last of her antiseptic, praying it would hold off any deeper complications. She sat by the drum fire, letting the warmth seep into her bones, all the while keeping an ear out for the pack's return. With trembling hands, she pulled a can of beans from her supplies, pried open the lid, and ate them cold. The taste was metallic and bland, but she forced them down. She offered a small prayer for strength, for the storm to end, for the wolves to stay away, for the Mustang to survive another day. Sleep tugged at her again, and this time she allowed herself to doze lightly, leaning against the barn wall, pitchfork within arm's reach. The horse eventually lay down too, its breath rattling in the quiet pockets of the night. When she finally woke, the wind had lessened to a muted roar, and a faint grey light seeped through the gaps in the boards. She stood, wincing at the aches in her body, and saw the Mustang watching her with tired eyes. She realized they had survived another night. She gathered her frayed courage and approached the barn door. Carefully, she pushed it open enough to peer outside. The storm had diminished, though not fully past. The sky was a heavy cloak of grey, and snow drifts towered around the barn. She saw no immediate sign of the wolves, but their tracks were everywhere. Large paw prints circling the barn, some half filled with fresh snow, others leading off into the distance. It was unnerving to see so many, a reminder of how close they had come to being dinner for a hungry pack. But for now, it seemed the wolves had moved on. She began to formulate a plan. If the worst of the storm had passed, she might attempt to reach the cabin, retrieve the rifle, and bring back whatever else she could. The Mustang was still alive, but it wouldn't survive long without more substantial food and warmth. She stepped outside, heart pounding, pitchfork at the ready. The landscape looked like a frozen wasteland. Tall drifts formed a maze, and the sky threatened more snow. She trudged toward the cabin, each step a labor. By the time she reached it, her legs were shaking. She found the rifle near the wood stove, as well as a handful of bullets. The old weapon had seen better days, but it was better than nothing. With it slung across her shoulder, she gathered a few extra blankets, the last of her firewood, and some cans of food. Loading herself with these supplies, she made the grueling journey back to the barn. The day wore on in a haze of tasks, checking the horse's wound, making a more stable fire setup, and constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the wolf pack. She caught glimpses of movement in the trees from time to time, but couldn't be certain if it was wolves or just the wind stirring the branches. She kept the rifle close. Despite the lingering cold, the Mustang seemed slightly stronger, standing on shaky legs and even taking a few steps around the stall. She murmured encouragement, praising it quietly for its resilience. It felt odd, almost surreal, to be talking to a wild horse. Yet in this secluded world of ice and snow, they were each other's only companions. Days blurred together in this cycle of survival. She melted snow over the fire to provide water for herself and the horse. She rationed her food, chewing on jerky and beans. When she had enough energy, she tried to shovel paths around the barn so she could keep an eye on any approaching threats. The Mustang's wounds slowly scabbed over, though she worried about infection. At times, she found herself explaining her life story to the horse. How she'd married her husband at a young age, how they'd lost their first ranch in a recession and decided to build a new here in the remote wilderness. How he'd passed suddenly from a heart condition they never even knew he had. Grief welled in her throat, but she'd keep talking, as if the Mustang's listening ears offered some form of silent therapy. On one particularly cold morning, she woke to a renewed onslaught of wind. The old barn door rattled on its hinges, and she sensed a shift in the air. A glance outside confirmed it. A new storm system was blowing in, this one accompanied by ominous clouds that looked darker than any she'd seen before. Her muscles tensed. She'd just begun to hope the worst was behind them, and now nature threatened to unleash another brutal wave. She debated whether to move the horse to the cabin, but the cabin's interior was too cramped for such a large animal, and reinforcing the barn might be her best bet. She set about bracing the walls with spare planks, nails, and whatever she could find. Sweat beaded on her forehead, freezing almost instantly in the frigid air. The Mustang followed her with its eyes, occasionally stepping out of the stall to investigate her work. She couldn't help but smile at its curiosity. That afternoon, the temperature plummeted again. The wind picked up, and soon the air was thick with swirling snow. She heard distant howls. Whether they were carried on the wind from miles away or close by, she couldn't tell. The day turned to night, and she found herself in near darkness, the lantern's glow feeble against the swallowing gloom. She curled up against the horse's side at one point, seeking warmth from its body. Strangely, the horse didn't protest. She felt the steady rise and fall of its breathing, the warmth radiating through the blanket. Outside, the storm raged, like an enraged beast. The walls shuddered, and she braced herself for the possibility that the barn might not hold. Hours passed in a twilight of exhaustion. She drifted in and out of a restless half-sleep, always on edge. When the wind finally subsided, it was close to dawn again. She staggered to her feet, stiff and groggy. The Mustang stood near the door, ears alert. She peered outside and caught a glimpse of a pale sun behind thinning clouds. The worst of this new storm had passed, but the cold was still vicious. Snow drifts towered even higher now, and she wondered if she'd ever see the main road again. Determined to push forward, she decided she needed to break out of this isolation. Perhaps there was a chance she could ride the Mustang to safety. The thought was terrifying. This was a wild horse, and it was still recovering. But desperation can forge strange partnerships. She spent the next day coaxing the Mustang, gently introducing the concept of a saddle blanket, though she didn't have a proper saddle for it. She found a rope that might serve as a makeshift bridle. The horse eyed her warily but didn't lash out, perhaps sensing their mutual need. She was a decent rider, having grown up around horses, but she'd never tried to break a wild Mustang, especially not in the midst of a life-threatening winter. Each attempt to guide or direct the horse was fraught with tension. Still, a tentative bond had formed between them. The Mustang allowed her to place the rope around its neck, though it rolled its eyes and twitched nervously. Little by little, she felt they were making progress. one small victory at a time. She could see in the horse's stance that it was regaining some strength. Its eyes no longer looked so sunken, and it held its head a bit higher. The scars on its flank were healing. With each passing hour, the sense that they might actually survive grew. By the time the moon rose that night, clear and bright in a sky filled with shimmering stars, she felt a cautious optimism. She was jolted awake again by the sound of wolves. They returned, lured by the lingering scent of blood and the raw smell of horseflesh. This time, she had the rifle close at hand. Heart pounding, she inched to the barn door, peering through a crack. Several dark shapes moved against the snow. She glimpsed the reflection of their eyes in the moonlight. There was no option to cower inside this time. The horse was too valuable a prize for them to give up. Clutching the rifle, she unlatched the door, stepping out into the bitter cold. The Mustang followed her to the threshold, ears pinned back, breathing hard. The wolves paced in a rough semicircle around the barn, 4 or 5 that she could see. She raised the rifle and fired, a warning shot into the air. The crack of gunfire echoed across the frozen night. One wolf snarled, snapping its jaws. Another crouched, ready to leap. She fired again, this time aiming near the lead wolf. The shot grazed the snow at its paws. They scattered momentarily, but she knew they wouldn't vanish so easily. They fanned out, trying to flank her. She felt her knees shake. Could she reload in time if they rushed her? A growl from behind made her whip around. One of the wolves had managed to circle behind the barn. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the rifle. The Mustang let out a fierce snort, stamping the ground. In a desperate move, she fired a shot at the wolf closing in from behind. It yelped and darted away, wounded or at least spooked. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She felt more alive, more terrified than she ever had in her life. The other wolves, seeing the rifle flash, hesitated. With a trembling arm, she pointed the rifle at them, screaming at the top of her lungs, a primal roar of defiance. For a moment, time froze. The wolves stood still, ears erect, assessing the situation. The Mustang pawed the ground, as though it were challenging them too. Then, with a collective snarl, the wolves made their move. She fired off another shot, catching one in the shoulder. The rest charged. Her mind reeled. There was no way she could reload in time to fend them all off. She braced for impact, lifting the rifle like a club. But the Mustang charged forward, hooves pounding the snow, letting out a shrieking whinny that echoed like thunder. It kicked at the nearest wolf, connecting with a sickening thud. The wolf flew backward, yelping in pain. Another wolf latched onto the Mustang's leg, but the horse bucked, thrashing violently until the wolf lost its grip. She seized the moment to slam the rifle butt into the head of a wolf that lunged at her. The creature yelped and retreated, blood staining the pristine snow. The Mustang reared, hooves flailing, eyes wild. In those terrifying seconds, she and the horse fought side by side against the pack. 2 more wolves slunk away, limping, uncertain. The Alpha, a large, dark-furred beast, held its ground, teeth bared. She had no bullets left. Her heart raced as she stared down the Alpha. It snarled, hackles raised. The Mustang stood next to her, sides heaving, steam billowing from its nostrils in the cold air. She locked eyes with the Alpha wolf, and for a heartbeat, everything went silent. Then, with a huff, the Alpha turned and bounded off into the darkness, the remaining wolves following, defeated for now. She stood there, gasping, adrenaline pulsing through her system. The Mustang quivered, blood dripping from a fresh bite on its leg. But they were alive. They had won, or at least survived. She guided the limping horse back into the barn, heart-wrenching at the new wound. Quickly, she cleansed it with melted snow, using the last strips of cloth as bandages. The horse trembled. Exhaustion etched into every muscle. She too felt the toll of the fight. Her arms ached, her lungs burned, and her mind reeled with the magnitude of what had just happened. They had stood together against the pack and somehow made it through. With shaking hands, she built up the fire in the metal drum, letting the warmth wash over them. The Mustang collapsed onto the straw, eyes half-lidded. She slumped next to it, pitchfork, rifle, and everything else forgotten. Sobs racked her body, a release of fear, triumph, and grief all at once. When she finally calmed, she rested her hand on the horse's neck. Its dark eyes flickered open, and for a moment, she swore it understood her gratitude. She whispered, "Thank you," though it was unclear who saved whom. She must have fallen asleep there, because when she woke, the sun filtered through the barn's cracks, casting long beams across the floor. Her joints screamed in protest as she got up. The Mustang stirred, standing slowly. She checked the new bite wound. It was painful, but not as dire as she'd feared. She changed the bandage carefully, murmuring soft reassurances. Their shared ordeal seemed to have forged an even deeper bond. She felt no fear that it would lash out. In fact, it stood quietly as she worked, nuzzling her shoulder when she finished. Outside, the winter world glistened under a pale sun, a stark contrast to the violence of the night before. The drifts were tall, and the crisp air stung her lungs, but for the first time in days, she saw something other than swirling white. The air was still, the sky a brilliant blue. She could almost pretend the worst was over. Mustering her resolve, she decided to see how far she could travel. Perhaps the nearby creek wasn't completely frozen, and she could refill her water containers more easily. Or maybe she could scout for any sign of help. She prepped the Mustang as best she could, tying the rope around its neck. The horse snorted, but didn't resist. She climbed onto its back gingerly, afraid the added weight might be too much. To her surprise, the Mustang handled it. Its muscles tensed, but it didn't buck her off. The moment she clicked her tongue and gave a light squeeze with her legs, it stepped forward through the barn door. Outside, the snow reached almost to its belly in places, but the Mustang pressed on. They made slow progress, forging a path through the drifts. The quiet was unsettling after so many nights of roaring wind. She kept the rifle slung across her back, though she had no bullets left. She prayed they wouldn't run into any more wolves. The horse breathed heavily, but it was steady. She guided it toward a stand of trees that lined the property, her eyes peeled for movement. As they reached the tree line, she heard the sound of running water. A miracle. The creek had partially frozen, but a trickle still ran beneath the ice in the center. She dismounted and carefully broke a thin layer of ice, scooping water into her canteen. The horse drank eagerly from the cold stream, ears flicking in relief. She filled another container for the Mustang. It was a small victory in their ongoing battle with nature. From her vantage near the creek, she gazed back at the barn and the cabin in the distance. Her footprints were the only sign of life in the otherwise virgin snow, aside from the scattered wolf tracks that had partially filled in overnight. She felt a strange swell of pride. They had survived threats that would break lesser spirits, but they weren't free of danger yet. The food supply was dangerously low, and though the storm had calmed for the moment, the season was far from over. Still, hope flickered in her heart. If they could find a way to signal for help, or perhaps reach the road, they might endure until the spring thaw or until someone braved the path out here. She thought about her radio in the cabin, the one that had lost power when the generator failed. If she could fix it, or find a spare battery, maybe she could call out. One step at a time, she reminded herself. She mounted the horse again, wincing at the fresh bruises on her body, and they returned to the barn. Over the next few days, she repeated the trip to the creek, fetching water and scanning the horizon for any sign of rescue. Each time, the Mustang seemed surer on its feet, as though her care had helped it reclaim its wild strength. She practiced guiding the horse with gentle reins fashioned from rope, speaking softly to it, praising it whenever it responded. That intangible bond between them grew. She felt the horse trusted her enough to follow her lead, and in turn, she entrusted the horse with her life each time they ventured out into the wolf-haunted wilderness. At last, after many more nights that, blurred together in a swirl of freezing wind and cautious watch. The day came when the snowdrifts began to melt just enough to hint at a path to the main road. The storms had eased, replaced by the biting but calmer cold of late winter. The Mustang's wounds, though still healing, no longer bled. She decided that if they stayed here much longer, they risked starvation. The time had come to attempt a journey. She packed what little food she had left, some survival gear, extra blankets, and the rifle. She couldn't carry much, and she knew the trip was perilous, but staying put felt just as dangerous. She left a note pinned to the cabin door in case any rescue party came by. Then she led the horse out into the silent expanse of snowy fields. Her plan was to follow a shallow valley that would eventually intersect with a dirt road leading to the nearest highway. It was a trek her husband had done many times in better weather. She hoped the wolves wouldn't ambush them along the way. In the early morning light, the Mustang plodded through the snowdrifts, its breath puffing in white clouds. She walked beside it at first to spare its strength. As they progressed, the drifts lessened, and patches of ground emerged, slick with ice. Eventually, she felt confident enough to ride again. Carefully, she mounted the horse, navigating around half-frozen streams and rocky outcrops. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crunch of hooves in snow and the distant groan of ice shifting. The sun rose higher, bringing a feeble warmth that melted a crust of ice on the land. Water trickled from the edges of rocks, hinting that spring was on its distant approach. She clung to that sign of renewal as a good omen. They stopped to rest when the sun reached its zenith. She gave the horse a small portion of oats she'd salvaged from the barn and ate some jerky herself. All the while, she scanned the tree line, half expecting to see wolves or some other threat. But the land was eerily still, as if drained of life by the relentless winter. Gathering her courage, she pressed on, leading the Mustang up a gentle slope that would provide a better view. Upon reaching the top, she felt her breath catch. There, below them, was the road, a ribbon of white flanked by bare trees. It looked abandoned, covered in patches of snow and ice, but it was a road nonetheless. That meant civilization, eventually. She gently urged the Mustang forward. They descended the slope carefully, the horse's hooves skidding occasionally on hidden ice. Every slip made her heart lurch, but the Mustang maintained its footing. When they reached the road, she guided it onto the path, uncertain if following it might lead them to safety or deeper into danger. As they traveled along the road, shadows lengthened. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. She began to worry about finding shelter for the night. Her thoughts turned to any old cabins or ranger stations that might be in this area. Memory was hazy, but she recalled hearing about a ranger station some miles up the road. If they could reach that, they might find supplies, or at least a roof to block the cold wind. The Mustang's pace slowed, signs of fatigue evident in its labored breath. She dismounted, walking beside it again, offering reassuring pats on its neck. Her own legs felt leaden, but she kept going, fueled by a stubborn will to survive. As dusk settled, the temperature dropped sharply. A biting wind picked up, and she realized they needed shelter immediately. Her eyes scanned the area in desperation, and at last she spotted a small structure nestled among the trees. A dilapidated hut or shed, perhaps. She guided the Mustang off the road, trudging through snow until they reached the building. It was barely standing, walls sagging and roof caved in on one side. But it was something. She pushed open the rotting door, and a swarm of dust and spiderwebs greeted them. The space was cramped, scattered with broken tools, but one corner was relatively intact. She cleared away debris, creating enough space for herself and hopefully the horse. The Mustang snorted at the threshold, hesitant to enter the cramped, unfamiliar enclosure. She coaxed it gently, and after a moment of hesitation, it stepped inside. She blocked the doorway with a loose board, hoping to keep some warmth in and potential predators out. The night was cold, but not as brutal as previous nights. She set up her small lantern and unrolled a blanket on the floor. The horse stood near her, shifting occasionally. Exhaustion weighed on her, but she stayed awake long enough to feed the Mustang another handful of oats and share some water. She drifted off. She remembered the first time she saw the horse, a forlorn figure at her doorstep in the heart of a blizzard. Now they were traveling companions, each relying on the other in ways neither could have predicted. When dawn broke, she woke shivering. The horse breathed softly beside her. She rose, shaking out her numb limbs, and peeked outside. The wind had died. The sky was overcast, but it didn't look like a major storm was brewing. She decided they'd push on, aiming for the ranger station she vaguely believed was in this direction. The Mustang seemed willing, plodding behind her as they left the shack. Hours passed in a quiet trek along the road, the sound of hooves crunching snow echoing around them. A few times she saw fresh tracks that looked like they might belong to wolves, but she didn't catch sight of the animals themselves. Anxiety nagged at her with every step, but she had no choice but to continue. She told herself the wolves might be hunting elsewhere, or perhaps had realized the Mustang was no easy prey. By mid-afternoon, fatigue gnawed at her. She considered stopping again, but then she saw something in the distance, a post with a red sign. She squinted, urging the Mustang forward. As they got closer, her heart leapt. It was a ranger station sign, battered by the elements but still legible. She followed it off the main road and onto a narrower trail. Not long after, a small wooden building came into view. She nearly cried in relief. The station looked unoccupied, but it was intact. She tethered the horse to a post and approached, rifle in hand just in case. The door was locked, but the windows were shuttered, and no smoke rose from the chimney. Likely it was abandoned for the season. With some effort, she managed to pry a window open and climb inside. The interior smelled stale, but it was better than sleeping in another collapsing hut. She unbolted the door from within and led the Mustang inside the small stable area attached to the station, clearly meant for horses during the summer months. The station was equipped with a wood stove, basic furnishings, and a first aid cabinet. Even better, she found a stash of long-lasting supplies and some emergency radio equipment. Joy surged through her. She immediately set about lighting away, fire in the stove, using the wood stacked neatly in a corner. Soon, a welcome heat spread through the cramped interior. She checked the first aid cabinet, finding bandages, disinfectant, and even some painkillers. She tended to her own bruises and the horse's wounds with renewed hope. In the supply closet, she located a box of freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, and a small battery for the radio. Her hands shook with excitement as she fiddled with the old radio, hooking it up and switching it on. Static filled the air. She turned the dial, praying for a connection. Finally, she heard a faint voice crackle through. It was a distant weather report, but it was something. She responded, voice trembling, identifying herself and her location, asking for assistance if anyone was out there. The static persisted. She repeated her call. Minutes felt like hours. Then, through the hiss and pops, a voice answered. It was barely intelligible, but she caught enough to understand that someone had heard her, that they might be able to send help once the roads cleared. She sank to her knees, tears welling, relief washing over her in waves. She crawled back to the stable area, where the Mustang stood, ears perked at the sound of her voice. She placed a hand on its muzzle, leaning her forehead against it. "We did it," she whispered. "We made it." The Mustang exhaled softly, as if sharing her relief. Over the next few days, she waited at the station, maintaining contact via the radio. She used the wood stove to keep warm and rationed the supplies carefully. She nursed the horse back to better health, cleaning its wounds and allowing it more space to move around the stable. Each day, she felt herself growing stronger, mentally and physically. She reflected on her journey, the nights spent huddled, in fear, the battles against the elements and the wolves. Through it all, this wild Mustang had become her ally, her symbol of perseverance. Finally, a week after she arrived at the station, a rescue team arrived on snowmobiles. She stepped outside to greet them, tears burning her eyes as she thanked them for coming. They seemed astonished to find her alive, and even more surprised to see she had a horse with her. She explained the storm, the wolves, everything that had happened. One of the rescuers, a gruff man with a kind smile, shook his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like it," he said. "You're one tough lady." They offered to take her to a hospital, but she insisted on bringing the horse, too. The Mustang was still skittish around strangers, but it didn't bolt. The men helped load it onto a trailer, and the group set off toward the nearest town. As they traveled, she watched the snow-covered forests pass by, remembering her husband and the life they'd shared. For the first time since his death, she felt a spark of hope, a sense of purpose. The Mustang had given her a reason to keep fighting, a reason to believe in miracles. And indeed, it had been a miracle that the horse found her, or perhaps that she had found it. At the town's small veterinary clinic, the Mustang received proper treatment, and the vet marveled at how the creature had survived such ordeals. She stood nearby, feeling protective, as though she were the Mustang's guardian. Once it was stable, she made arrangements to keep it on a friend's ranch outside of town. She refused to let it slip back into the wild without ensuring it had fully healed. Days turned into weeks, and she slowly rebuilt her life. She sold the remote cabin, deciding she needed a fresh start, and accepted her friend's invitation to stay on the ranch for a while. Each morning, she'd visit the Mustang, stroke its nose, and walk beside it in the paddock. The horse never lost its wild edge entirely, but it accepted her presence in a way she never expected. Locals who heard her story shook their heads in awe. A blizzard, a wolf pack, and a horse that came to her doorstep just in time. Some called it luck, others called it fate. She felt it was a bit of both. As she stood by the fence one bright morning, the Mustang trotted over, its coat glimmering. In the winter sun, scars healed into faint lines. She recalled the night she nearly froze to death in the barn, the horse nearly torn apart by the storm and its own wounds. They had saved each other. The horse tossed its head, and she smiled, reaching out to place a gentle hand on its neck. The townspeople whispered that the Mustang was a sign, a messenger that told her she wasn't alone in the world. Perhaps it was simply a creature that needed help, yet for her, it became the embodiment of resilience and hope. She thought back to the final hours in the barn, the savage fight against the wolves. That image of the Mustang rearing up, hooves lashing out to protect her, was seared into her memory. In that moment, she'd realized that in the vast tapestry of survival, every living thing could forge a bond under dire circumstances. By the time spring arrived, she felt a blossoming sense of renewal. She moved into a modest house near the ranch, one with enough land for the Mustang to roam if it so chose. On sunny days, she'd open the gate, letting the horse graze or explore the edge of the fields, half expecting it to vanish back into the wilderness. But the Mustang always returned, trotting back to her side, snorting softly, as if to say it was choosing to stay. One morning, she saddled it with a light riding blanket, attempting a gentle walk around the ranch. The horse accepted her guidance, stepping with a sure-footed ease that spoke of its wild heritage. Neighbors watched in amazement as she rode the Mustang across the pasture, the two of them silhouettes against the rising sun. Some snapped pictures, others simply stared in awe. She paid them little mind, focused on the profound connection she felt with the animal beneath her. In those moments, she felt truly alive again. Months later, after the snows melted and the fields turned green, she decided to share her story. She reached out to a local reporter who visited the ranch to interview her. The reporter listened with rapt attention as she described the deadly storms, the nights spent huddled in the barn, the desperate battles against hunger, cold, and wolves. The photograph that ran in the local paper showed her standing beside the Mustang, each bearing scars of a winter that tested their limits. People from neighboring towns and even distant cities sent letters of admiration and offers of assistance. She felt overwhelmed, having never sought fame or recognition. But she also felt grateful. The story of her survival resonated with others. It reminded them that miracles could happen, even in the bleakest circumstances. She often ended her tale with a note of gratitude to her husband's memory, to the Mustang's unwavering spirit, and to the raw wilderness that, despite nearly killing her, had forged her into someone stronger. If this story of survival and courage inspired you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Every day, we bring you incredible true stories of resilience. Don't miss out. Total.